had been planning a solo hiking and camping trip for a while. The idea of being out in nature with nothing but my backpack and a couple days of food always appealed to me. I lived in northern Idaho at the time, and there were plenty of trails that stretched far into the wilderness. I picked one that wasn't too well known, something off the main tourist routes, because I wanted quiet, not crowds. It was late September of 2016, and the air had that chill where mornings could frost over but afternoons still carried warmth if the sun was strong enough. I was 27 then, and I figured I could handle a 2-night trip alone. The trailhead was about an hour and a half outside town. I parked my old truck on the side of the gravel lot, slung my pack over my shoulders, and started walking into the trees. The first few miles felt easy. Pine needles muffled the ground, and every so often, a gust of wind would push through the branches with a sound that was almost like water rushing through a pipe. I kept a steady pace, my boots breaking twigs here and there. I saw no one, which was exactly what I had hoped for. By early afternoon, I reached a spot where the trail forked. The left path continued deeper into the mountains, while the right dipped toward a creek I'd seen on the map. I chose the creek. I wanted water nearby for camp, and I liked the idea of falling asleep to the sound of it. I hiked another mile before I found a flat clearing big enough for my small tent. I dropped my pack, stretched out my shoulders, and set everything up. The sun dropped quickly behind the ridgeline, and the temperature sank with it. I boiled some water on my little stove, poured it into a pouch of dehydrated pasta, and ate with my gloves still on. After, I sat against a log and listened to the night take over. The creek ran steady, insects buzzed in the grass, and an owl called somewhere far off. For a while, I felt at peace. It wasn't until I was lying inside my tent that I noticed something. Over the sound of the creek and the breeze, there was another noise, faint, almost rhythmic. At first I thought it was just branches creaking, but the more I listened, the more it felt like steps. Slow, deliberate steps on the forest floor. They weren't near, maybe a good distance off, but they came and went, as if someone was circling the area. I held my breath, waiting for them to fade. After a while, they did. The next morning, the ground was coated in dew, and my breath came out in white clouds. I packed up some snacks and went further along the creek to explore. I followed the water upstream, stepping on rocks and weaving through brush. The trail was faint here, almost non-existent. After about half a mile, I noticed something unusual. The soil near the bank had clear prints pressed into it. Not boot prints, not animal either. They looked bare, human bare, with all 5 toes visible in the mud. They weren't huge, maybe the size of my own foot, but they were fresh. I stood there staring at them, my skin prickling. Nobody hikes out here barefoot. The ground is sharp with rocks and sticks, and mornings like this are freezing cold. I kept following upstream but couldn't shake the image of those prints. Every time I stopped walking, the woods felt heavy and watchful, like something was waiting just out of sight. Back at camp that afternoon, I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe someone had been swimming or messing around near the creek in summer, and the prints had stayed preserved longer than usual. But that explanation didn't sit right. The edges were too sharp. They looked like they'd been made less than a day ago. That night, I built a small fire. Flames licked the wood, and the smoke curled up into the branches above. The sound made me feel safer, like I had control of this little patch of wilderness. Still, when darkness spread, I felt the unease return. I kept glancing over my shoulder, shining my flashlight at every snapping twig. Around midnight, I woke suddenly. No sound of fire remained. It had burned out hours ago. At first, everything was quiet except the creek. Then I heard it again, those same slow steps. This time, they were closer, circling tighter around my tent. Dry leaves cracked under weight. I froze, heart pounding, my sleeping bag pulled up tight to my chin. I didn't move, barely breathed. The steps stopped, and the silence after felt worse than the noise itself. I reached for my knife, kept it clutched against my chest, and forced myself to stay awake. Every muscle ached from staying tense. Eventually, I must have drifted off, because when I opened my eyes again, weak daylight was leaking through the tent fabric. I got out, shivering. The ground around my tent was disturbed. Leaves pushed aside, soil shifted. I scanned carefully and my stomach dropped. On one side, just a few feet from where I had been sleeping, were more bare footprints. Some pressed right into the soft dirt where my boot prints had been the day before. Whoever it was had been standing there, looking at my tent while I lay inside. My first thought was to pack up and get the hell out, but I was deep in at least 8 or 9 miles from the truck. If someone really was stalking me, I didn't want to panic and make myself more vulnerable. I tried to steady myself by thinking maybe it was just some eccentric local, someone odd but harmless. But then I remembered how deliberate the circling had sounded, how quiet they had moved, except for the steps they must have wanted me to hear. I decided I would hike back that morning. I packed fast, skipping breakfast, and stuffed my gear into the bag without care. The trail felt longer on the way out. Every stretch of trees looked the same, and every time the wind died down, I thought I heard someone behind me. At one point, I stopped completely and listened. Sure enough, faint and drawn out, there was a snap of a stick not far off. I didn't look back. I forced myself to keep going, my pace quick and uneven. Hours passed. My legs burned from pushing too hard, but I couldn't slow down. When I finally reached the fork where the creek trail met the main path, I nearly collapsed with relief. From there, it was another few miles to the parking lot. The whole time, I kept expecting to see someone. I never did. The forest stayed empty except for me. When the lot came into view and my truck sat just as I'd left it, a wave of relief hit me so hard I almost laughed. But when I looked closer, my skin went cold again. On the passenger side door, smeared into the dusty metal, was the print of a bare hand. Long fingers, pressed firm enough to leave streaks down the glass. I didn't check inside. I didn't look around. I unlocked the driver's door, threw my pack across the seat, and started the engine with shaking hands. Gravel spat from under the tires as I pulled out, not once looking into the mirrors. By the time I reached town, I was still trembling. I went straight to my apartment, locked the door, and sat there in silence. I told myself it could have been anyone. Maybe some drifter, maybe just a prank. But deep down, I knew it wasn't random. Whoever was out there had followed me. They had stood right by my tent in the dark and touched my truck before I even got back. I never returned to that trail. Even years later, the memory of those footsteps in the night comes back clear. I still go camping sometimes, but never alone, and never anywhere near that part of the forest. I still remember that trip in 2016 because it's the kind of thing that never really leaves your head no matter how many years pass. My boss at the time, Mark, had invited me to join him and his younger sister, Claire, on a camping trip up in the northern woods of Michigan. I wasn't the outdoors type at all, but Mark was one of those people you couldn't easily say no to, especially since he was the kind of boss who always acted like work never stopped. He said it would be a relaxing weekend, no emails, no deadlines, just a chance to breathe. Claire was about 25 then, a few years younger than me, friendly enough but quiet, more into reading and photography. The three of us loaded up his SUV early in the morning, the back packed tight with a tent, sleeping bags, a small stove, and more food than I thought we'd need. It was early October, that time when the leaves burn bright red and gold, but the air already bites when the sun drops. The drive took us nearly 6 hours, most of it on empty 2-lane roads that cut through endless forest. By the time we finally pulled into the dirt trail that led to the campsite, the light was already thinning. The spot Mark picked was deep in the woods, far off the beaten path. No other cars, no families with kids running around, no one at all. Just trees closing in around us and the sound of wind shaking through them. I remember stepping out of the SUV and the quiet hit me like a wall. It wasn't peaceful, not really. It was that heavy kind of silence where you become too aware of your own movements, every crunch of gravel under your boots sounding way too loud. We got the tent up before dark, though barely. It was bigger than I expected, one of those 6-person things that could fit cots inside. But the air was already cold enough that I worried about the night. Claire wandered off with her camera, crouching to take photos of moss and tree bark like she was trying to find beauty in every corner of the woods. Mark kept busy with the stove, heating up a pan of beans and sausages. I stood around awkwardly, hands in my pockets, listening to the forest pressing in on us. When the sun finally dropped, the woods changed. The color was gone, replaced with thick black shadows that seemed to reach in from every side. We built a fire, and its glow carved out a little circle of safety around us. The smoke rose and drifted, and every now and then I'd catch myself staring into the dark, half expecting to see something move. That first night, I didn't sleep much. Every sound jolted me awake. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, what could have been animals or maybe just the wind. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside the tent. Steady, heavy, not like the scurry of a deer or raccoon. I lay stiff in my sleeping bag, holding my breath, staring at the ceiling of the tent. The steps stopped, and I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Still, I barely shut my eyes until the gray light of morning crept in. The second day we hiked. Mark led us through the woods with a paper map he unfolded again and again, the edges worn and creased. Claire stopped often to take pictures, kneeling to photograph mushrooms or sunlight catching on spiderwebs. My legs burned from the constant walking, but I kept going, not wanting to be the one to slow them down. The deeper we went, the less like a trail it looked. At one point, I asked Mark if we even knew where we were, but he brushed it off with a laugh. By late afternoon, the sky had turned heavy, gray clouds sagging low. We made it back to camp just as the first drops fell. The rain came hard and fast, hammering the tent, soaking the ground. We sat inside on our sleeping bags, damp and restless, listening to the storm rage. It didn't stop until after midnight, and by then everything outside was dripping, slick with mud. The next morning, things felt different. The woods smelled of wet leaves and earth, but there was something else, too, something sharper. Claire noticed it first. She stepped out of the tent and froze. Not 20 feet away, near the tree line, there were boot prints in the mud. Not ours. They were fresh, pressed deep, heading toward our camp and then veering off. I followed the tracks with my eyes until they disappeared into the brush. Mark frowned but said nothing. He just went about making coffee on the stove. Claire looked pale, clutching her jacket tighter. My stomach twisted because it was obvious we weren't as alone as we thought. That night was worse than the first. The fire hissed low, the wood too wet to catch properly. The woods seemed alive, every sound magnified. At one point, I thought I saw a figure between the trees, just for a second, tall and unmoving. My chest tightened, but when I blinked, it was gone. Mark didn't notice, or maybe he pretended not to. Claire stayed close to the fire, her camera set aside for once. When we finally crawled into the tent, I couldn't relax. Hours passed. My eyes adjusted to the dark, watching shadows shift on the nylon walls. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, deliberate, circling. My heart slammed in my chest. Whoever it was didn't come closer, just moved around us, slow and steady. I wanted to shout, to do something, but my throat locked up. I lay there, sweating in the cold, until finally the sound faded away. The next morning, we found more prints. Clearer this time, right up against the edge of our fire pit, like someone had been standing there watching us sleep. My stomach dropped. Claire didn't speak, just started packing her bag. Mark's face was hard, jaw tight, no more brushing it off. We broke camp fast, faster than I thought possible. The air felt heavier with every minute, like the forest itself was closing in on us. The trail back to the SUV felt longer than before, my eyes darting to every tree, every movement in the brush. At one point, I heard a crack behind us, loud, like a branch snapping under weight. I turned, but there was nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling we were being followed. When we finally reached the SUV, the relief was so sharp it made my hands shake. But then I saw it. On the driver's side window, smeared in mud, was a handprint. Big, wide fingers pressed against the glass. Fresh. We didn't waste a second. Mark shoved our gear into the back, not caring how it landed. I climbed in, slamming the door so hard the whole car shook. Claire was already in the back seat, pale and shaking. Mark started the engine, and we tore down the dirt road, gravel spitting out from under the tires. I kept looking back through the rear window, half expecting to see someone step out onto the trail behind us. But there was nothing, just trees blurring past. We didn't stop until we hit the main road hours later, the sun already dipping behind the hills. We never talked about it again. Not at work, not anywhere. Claire deleted most of the photos she'd taken on that trip. Mark avoided camping stories after that, and I never set foot in the woods again. It's been years, but I still see it sometimes in my head. The muddy handprint on the glass, the steady footsteps circling the tent, the heavy silence of the forest pressing in. And what sticks with me most is the simplest, clearest part of it all. Someone had been out there with us, watching, waiting, and we'll never know who or why. I was 19 in the summer of 2006, and I thought I was braver than I really was. My friends had dared me to camp a night alone in an old graveyard on the edge of our town in northern Michigan. It wasn't the kind of place people visited anymore. The cemetery had been there since the 1800s, most of the stones tilted sideways or half buried under weeds. The whole area boxed in by rusted iron fencing and thick trees. The challenge was simple. Take a small tent, spend the night there, and walk out in the morning. No phone, no flashlight, only a lighter and a candle if I needed light. I didn't tell them, but I wanted to do it partly because I liked the feeling of proving something to myself. I had been restless since high school ended, drifting with no real plans. I thought maybe if I could pull this off, it would feel like I'd actually done something bold. That's what I told myself when I zipped up my backpack and started walking toward the cemetery just before sunset. The air was hot but heavy that evening, the kind of weather where even the shadows looked damp. The closer I got to the graveyard, the quieter the road became. Houses thinned out, and tall trees leaned over the road until it felt like I was walking into some kind of tunnel. By the time I reached the iron gates, the last of the sun was falling behind the tree line, staining everything in that reddish gold color that makes ordinary places look harsher. The cemetery wasn't large, maybe only 2 acres, but once I stepped inside, the silence was deeper. I noticed the faint buzz of bugs and the way my boots scuffed against gravel, but nothing else. I picked a spot near the center, where the ground was flat and free of too many roots. The grass had grown high in some places, brushing my shins, and the smell was earthy and damp, almost moldy. I pitched my tent slowly, making sure every corner was staked down tight. I knew there was no rain coming, but I wanted it secure anyway. By the time I finished, the light had almost gone. The first hour wasn't bad. I sat outside the tent, eating a granola bar, listening to the sounds of crickets starting up. The candle I had set flickered weakly against the tall gravestones, making them look taller and stranger. I tried to distract myself by reading the names carved into the closest stones. Most of them were from the late 1800s, some too worn to make out clearly. A few belonged to children. I found myself staring at one for too long. A stone that had tipped halfway into the dirt, the name almost gone. For some reason, it made me uneasy. When full darkness came, the air grew cooler. The silence sharpened. The crickets seemed distant, like they had moved farther away from the cemetery itself. I blew out the candle to save it, slid into the tent, and lay back on my thin sleeping bag. I thought maybe I'd drift off, but my body wouldn't relax. Every sound stood out. An occasional rustle in the weeds, a faint thump like something dropping in the trees. It wasn't enough to be alarming, but it kept my eyes open. It must have been close to midnight when I heard footsteps. They weren't loud, but they were steady, crunching on gravel somewhere beyond the tent. My body froze instantly. I tried to tell myself it could be an animal, maybe a deer moving through, but deer don't walk slow, and even like that. The steps came closer, stopping for a moment, then continuing again. I didn't breathe. The steps circled, not close enough to brush the tent, but near enough that I could feel where they were. Whoever it was didn't hurry. They moved with the kind of calm pace of someone who knows exactly where they are. I clenched my fists and tried not to move. The steps stopped. The silence pressed down so hard I could hear my own heartbeat. After a few minutes, I worked up the nerve to peel open the tent zipper an inch and peek outside. The moon was up, bright enough to light the stones, but the space between them was heavy with shadow. I didn't see anyone. The grass was still, the fence far in the background. My skin crawled. I ducked back in, zipped the flap, and sat with my knees pulled up. Another 20 minutes passed before I heard it again. This time, it wasn't footsteps. It was the sound of something brushing against the iron fence. A scrape, then a low rattle like hands testing the old metal bars. My throat tightened. I knew it couldn't be the wind. The air was still. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to hide. But they also weren't doing anything directly to me. They just stayed near. The sound stopped, but I couldn't sleep after that. I kept waiting, straining to hear every little shift outside. Around 3 a.m., I smelled cigarette smoke. It drifted faintly into the tent, that sharp, bitter odor of cheap tobacco. My stomach turned. Nobody I knew smoked out there, and there were no houses close enough for it to carry. It was coming from somewhere inside the graveyard. I stayed perfectly still, but my thoughts were racing. Why would anyone else be here at this hour? There was no reason. And why circle my tent without saying anything? I pictured someone watching me from between the stones, smoking slow, knowing I couldn't see them. The longer I thought about it, the worse it became. I decided I couldn't just sit there. Around 4:30, the sky started to gray faintly at the edges, and I knew I could leave soon. I quietly packed my bag inside the tent, trying not to make noise. Every little zipper and rustle sounded too loud. When I finally slid out, the ground was damp with dew, and the air carried that early morning chill. I didn't see anyone. The graveyard looked empty in the half-light, calm even. But as I walked toward the gate, I noticed something in the grass not far from my tent. It was the end of a cigarette, crushed flat, still faintly smelling of smoke. The ash was fresh, no dew on it. My chest went tight. Someone had been there, and they hadn't left long ago. I didn't run, but I walked fast, keeping my head down until I was out of the gate and back on the road. I didn't stop moving until I reached the first row of houses, where I finally let myself breathe. I told my friends later that I spent the night there without a problem, that it was boring. I didn't tell them about the footsteps or the cigarette. Part of me knew they'd think I was exaggerating, and another part didn't want to admit how close I felt to real danger. Looking back now, I realized how stupid it was. It wasn't the graveyard that was scary. It was the thought that someone else had chosen to be there in the middle of the night, watching me, waiting quietly in the dark. That's what sticks with me. Whenever I smell smoke on the wind now, I remember the way it drifted into the tent and how helpless I felt, knowing I wasn't alone. I never went back to that cemetery. I was 26 years old when I went on a hunting trip in the fall of 2014. I had been hunting since I was a teenager, but never for more than a day or two at a time. That year, I decided to go deeper into the woods than I ever had before and stay for several nights. I had bought myself a new tent, a heavier sleeping bag, and some gear I thought would keep me comfortable even in the colder nights of late October. The place I chose was a dense patch of forest in northern Michigan, about 4 hours from my small apartment in Grand Rapids. I parked my truck at the end of a dirt service road where hunters usually left their vehicles. From there, I hiked about 2 miles into the woods, following an old trail that wasn't marked anymore but still faintly visible if you knew what to look for. The leaves were already turning shades of brown and orange, crunching under my boots as I made my way in. The air was cool, the kind of dry coolness that seeps into your nose and lungs, reminding you that winter isn't far away. By the time I set up camp, the sun was getting low. I chose a spot that was flat, close enough to a small stream for water, but far enough that I wouldn't hear it all night. I pitched my tent, stacked some firewood, and got myself organized. It always feels good on that first evening. Everything neat, food bags tied, rifle leaning against a tree, fire crackling. There's a strange mix of comfort and unease being that far from people. You feel proud for being out there, but also a little exposed, like if something went wrong, nobody would know. The first day of hunting was uneventful. I woke up before sunrise, had some coffee from my little camp stove, and hiked out with my rifle. I sat for hours in a makeshift blind I had put together near a game trail, watching, listening, waiting. I saw squirrels darting, a few birds, and at one point I thought I heard a deer moving in the brush, but it never showed. By the time I returned to camp, it was almost dark. I cooked some beans and rice over the fire, ate in silence, and tried not to think about how quiet the forest was once the sun went down. The second night was when things started to change. I woke up around midnight to a sound. At first, I thought it was the wind pushing through the branches, but then I realized it was footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps. They weren't the scattered, uneven steps of an animal sniffing around. These were steady, deliberate. They circled my camp. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, listening hard. I didn't have a clock, but I felt like it went on for 10 minutes, maybe more. Crunching leaves, breaking twigs, pausing, moving again. I kept my hand on the handle of my hunting knife, though I knew the rifle leaning against the tree would have been better. Still, I couldn't make myself unzip the tent and look out. Eventually, the steps faded. I stayed awake until dawn, heart racing, every sound amplified. In the morning, I stepped out of the tent and checked the ground around my camp. There were prints in the leaves. Not boots, but not deer either. The impressions looked like heavy shoes or maybe boots with smooth soles, which was strange because most hunters wore lugged soles. They weren't mine, and they weren't near the path I had used to come in. They circled the tent, then disappeared into the trees. That day, I barely hunted. My mind wasn't in it. I kept glancing over my shoulder, listening more than looking through the scope. I cut the day short and returned to camp early. When the sun set, I tried to convince myself it had been another hunter, someone lost or wandering, maybe looking for their own camp. But something about how slow and deliberate those steps were didn't sit right. The third night was worse. I forced myself to stay awake by the fire as long as I could, staring into the dark trees, ears tuned for the slightest crack. Around 1 in the morning, I heard it again. Footsteps, this time closer, bolder. I doused my fire quickly so I wouldn't be glowing like a target and sat in the dark. The sound moved around me, sometimes near, sometimes farther. I could almost picture a figure out there, circling just beyond my sight. At one point, I heard the sound of something brushing against the fabric of my tent. Just a faint drag, like fingers or cloth sliding across nylon. My throat went dry. I gripped the rifle in my lap, safety off, finger tense but not pulling. My ears rang with my own heartbeat. After a while, the sounds faded into the distance again, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched the whole time. At dawn, I made up my mind. I was going to leave. Hunting wasn't worth whatever this was. I packed my gear quickly, hardly eating, and started the hike back to my truck. The forest felt different on the way out, heavier, as if it was pressing in closer. Every snapping twig made me jerk around. At one point, I swore I saw movement behind me, a flicker of something dark slipping behind the trees, but when I stared, nothing was there. When I finally reached the dirt road where my truck was parked, my relief turned to ice. Someone had gone through my truck. The driver's side door was slightly open, though I always lock it. Inside, my glove box was open, papers scattered on the seat. Nothing major was stolen. The shotgun was still in its case behind the seat, my spare gas can still in the bed, but it was clear someone had been inside. The strangest part was that the rearview mirror had been tilted all the way down, like whoever sat in the driver's seat was shorter than me and had adjusted it. I didn't waste time. I threw my gear into the back, slammed the door shut, and drove. I didn't even look in the rearview mirror until I was on the paved highway an hour later. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel the whole way home. For weeks afterward, I thought about what happened. I replayed every sound, every footprint, every detail. The woods are full of animals, but none walk like that. Hunters don't circle camps in the middle of the night without saying anything. And whoever it was, they had followed me far enough to find my truck and open it up. I never went back to that forest. I still hunt, but never alone, and never that deep anymore. There are things in the woods that don't need to be explained by myths or stories. Just people who choose to move quietly in the dark, who watch without being seen, who make sure you know you're not as alone as you thought. The scariest part is realizing that sometimes the woods aren't empty. Sometimes someone is out there and they don't want you to know why. I was 22 when I decided to take a solo camping trip in Austria. It was summer of 2018, late July, and I had been backpacking through Europe for about a month. Most of the places I stayed were hostels in small towns, but I wanted a break from people, a chance to be alone and breathe away from crowded trains and noisy dorm rooms. I had read about a small valley near the Salzkammergut region, surrounded by lakes and quiet trails. It wasn't far from Bad Ischl, and I figured it would be the perfect spot to pitch my tent for a night or two. I arrived late afternoon after a long bus ride. The air felt clean, sharp with pine. The trail wound past meadows and old wooden farmhouses, the kind with flower boxes overflowing with red geraniums. I walked for about an hour before finding a clearing just above a narrow river. It wasn't an official campsite, but it was flat and tucked away enough that I wouldn't bother anyone. I dropped my pack, set up my tent, and boiled water on my small stove. By the time I finished eating, the sun was already low, the light falling golden over the hills. I sat for a while, listening to the water and the occasional rustle of leaves. There was no phone service this deep in the valley, but that was part of the reason I came. As night fell, the air cooled quickly. I pulled on a jacket and stretched out by the fire I had built. I remember how quiet it was, so quiet that my own breathing sounded too loud. Around 9, I heard something further up the trail, not close, but distinct. The sound of steady footsteps on gravel. At first, I thought it was a hiker making their way back to the town, maybe someone who had stayed out late. But the steps didn't fade away. They paused, then started again, slower, crunching against the dirt. I turned my head toward the path, my body stiff. It was too dark to see clearly, but eventually, a figure came into view. It was a man, maybe in his late 40s or early 50s. Tall, thin, with broad shoulders hunched slightly as he walked. He wore a long jacket even though the day had been warm. His steps dragged just enough to sound uneven. He didn't carry a backpack or any gear, which struck me as strange for someone out here. He wasn't walking fast, just steady, like he had nowhere specific to be. I stayed still, pretending to fuss with my stove. He stopped about 20 meters up the trail, where the clearing met the trees. Even in the dim light, I could tell he was staring at me. Not a glance, not a curious look you'd give a camper. It was longer, fixed, like he was studying me. I felt my skin prickle. I kept my head down, tried not to move too suddenly, but I could sense his eyes. He stood there for what felt like minutes. Then, without a word, he turned slightly and walked into the trees. Not further down the trail, not back toward the town, just straight into the forest. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just a local, maybe he had a cabin out here. But the way he stopped and stared didn't feel normal. I doused the fire earlier than I had planned and crawled into my tent, leaving my pack close by in case I needed to move quickly. Sleep didn't come easy. Every snap of a twig outside felt like a warning. Around midnight, I heard something again, faint but deliberate. Not the distant sound of animals, but heavier. Steps in the brush, too close to ignore. They circled slowly, stopping now and then continuing. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, barely breathing, straining to hear. At one point, I swear I heard the crunch of boots just a few meters from my tent. Then silence. Long, unbearable silence. I didn't dare move. Hours passed that way. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted in and out of shallow sleep. When I finally sat up, the sky was turning pale gray. I unzipped the tent slowly, every muscle tight. The clearing looked normal at first glance. But then I noticed the ground near the edge of the trees. Fresh boot prints in the soft dirt. They weren't mine. They circled the clearing, close enough to my tent that whoever made them had been standing right outside while I was inside. I packade fast. My hands shook as I rolled my sleeping bag, fumbling with the straps. I couldn't get out of there quick enough. Every sound in the forest made me whip my head around, expecting to see him standing there. The trail felt different on the way back, heavier somehow, like the forest was watching me. I didn't stop for water, didn't eat, just walked fast until I reached the first farmhouse on the edge of the valley. The relief of seeing smoke from a chimney and hearing the bark of a dog almost made me weak. I didn't tell anyone at the farmhouse what had happened. I just kept going, back to the bus stop, back into the noise of town. Part of me wanted to forget it, to push it away as nothing. But the memory stayed sharp. The man's stare, the sound of footsteps circling my tent, the prints in the dirt. I never went back to camp alone after that. Every time I think about it, the same thought creeps in. He wasn't passing by, he wasn't lost. He was watching, waiting. And if I hadn't stayed so still, if I had stepped out of my tent in the dark, I don't know what I would have seen waiting for me. That night taught me something important. Out in the wilderness, it's not the animals or the weather you should fear most. It's the people who don't belong there, the ones with no reason to be walking alone in the dark. I was 26 years old the summer I decided to take a short camping trip by myself. It was late July of 2014, and I had a few days off from work. I lived in Colorado back then, in a small town not too far from the mountains, so the idea of heading out alone didn't seem too unusual to me. I'd done hikes and even a couple of overnight trips with friends before, but this time I wanted the quiet. I wanted to be away from people, phones, and noise. I left early in the morning and drove about 2 hours west. The air got cooler the higher I went. I had studied maps the night before and decided on a spot near an old fire road, one that wasn't used much anymore. It wasn't an official campsite, but that was the point. I wanted real solitude. I parked my car off a dirt pull-off, loaded my pack with food, water, and gear, and started hiking up into the trees. The trail was rough and uneven, a mix of rock and hard dirt with roots cutting across. I carried a small tent, a sleeping bag, some food packed in Ziplocs, and a headlamp. The sun was already bright by the time I reached the ridge, and I could feel sweat soaking into the straps of my pack. It took about 2 hours of steady walking before I found a clearing that felt right. It was flat enough for my tent and close to a small stream where I could get water. I set up my tent in the clearing, staked it down, and unrolled my sleeping bag inside. After that, I sat down on a log, ate a sandwich I had packed, and let myself relax. For a while, it felt perfect. The silence was thick except for the breeze in the trees and the sound of the stream running nearby. By late afternoon, I had gathered some firewood and made a small fire in a circle of rocks. I cooked some instant noodles, sitting cross-legged on the ground while the sky began to shift colors. The blue faded into orange, then into a slow, dark purple. I remember staring at the tree-line, watching as the woods grew darker. It was peaceful but also heavy. Once the sun was gone, the woods felt different, less friendly. I had brought a book with me and read for a while by the firelight, but every so often I found myself looking up, scanning the trees. It wasn't that I heard anything strange, just small things. A branch breaking, leaves crunching far off. Normal wood sounds, I told myself. Still, the dark around me pressed closer, and the fire felt like the only safe spot. Around 10, I decided to get some rest. I poured water over the fire until it hissed out and crawled into my tent. Inside, it was warmer and quieter. I zipped the flap shut, turned off my headlamp, and lay down. I could hear the stream gurgling a little way off, insects buzzing, and the faint rustle of the forest. Eventually, I drifted into sleep. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. My eyes opened suddenly, and for a second I didn't know where I was. The tent was dark, the air cooler now, and I could hear something. It wasn't the stream or the insects. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate steps moving through the leaves and brush. I held my breath and froze. The sound grew closer, stopping and starting like whoever it was paused often. It didn't sound like an animal. I'd heard deer and elk before. They moved differently, quicker, lighter. These steps were heavy enough to make the ground crunch each time. My heart thudded in my chest as I lay there, staring into the black of the tent. I thought about grabbing my flashlight, but was afraid the light would give me away. So I stayed still. The steps circled slowly around my camp, first behind the tent, then off to the side. At one point, I swore I heard the sound of something brushing against my backpack where I had left it outside, leaning against the log. Minutes passed, or maybe it was longer. It felt endless. Eventually, the steps faded into the woods. I stayed awake, straining my ears, but heard nothing more after that. I told myself it was just a hiker passing by, maybe lost or curious. Still, I barely slept the rest of the night. When morning came, I crawled out of the tent and looked around. My pack was where I left it, but one of the straps was shifted like it had been moved. I brushed it off, telling myself I might have left it that way. After breakfast, I went to the stream to refill my bottles. That's when I noticed boot prints in the damp soil near the edge of the clearing. Not mine. Too large, and the tread was different. The sight made my stomach sink. Someone had been there, Someone had walked right through my camp while I slept. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it didn't matter. Maybe it was just another camper. Maybe they had left already. I packed some snacks and went for a short hike to take my mind off it. But even during the hike, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I stopped, the woods felt too quiet. No birds, no rustling, nothing. I cut the hike short and went back to camp. That night, I built a fire again, but the comfort of it was gone. I kept looking at the trees, waiting to see something. The light faded, and once again the woods became heavy and dark. I ate quickly, put out the fire, and went into the tent. I lay awake for a long time, clutching the small camping knife I always kept with me. It must have been after midnight when I heard it again. The footsteps. They came from the same direction as before, slow and steady. This time, I heard breathing too, faint but real. Someone was outside. My skin prickled, and every instinct screamed at me to stay silent. The steps came closer until they were right outside the tent. I could see the shadow of movement through the thin nylon fabric. The sound of fingers brushing lightly against the tent wall made me grip the knife tighter. My pulse hammered in my throat. The person stood there for what felt like forever, then moved away back into the woods. I didn't sleep at all after that. At first light, I packed up everything in a rush. My hands were shaking as I shoved the tent into my bag. I didn't bother with breakfast. I just wanted to get out. The hike back down was fast, almost a jog. I kept looking behind me, convinced I would see someone following. When I finally reached the dirt pull-off and saw my car, relief washed over me. I threw my pack into the back seat and got inside, locking the doors. As I started the engine, I looked at the edge of the trees one last time. For just a second, I thought I saw movement, the shape of a person half hidden in the branches. I didn't wait to be sure. I drove out of there, gravel spitting from my tires. By the time I reached the highway, I felt like I could finally breathe again. I had planned to stay 2 more nights, but I never went back to that area. Even now, years later, the thought of those footsteps outside my tent makes my chest tighten. Whoever was out there never said a word, never showed their face. They just walked the edge of my campsite, close enough to touch my tent, watching. It was enough to remind me that being alone in the woods doesn't always mean you're really alone. I was 28 when I went on that camping trip, back in the summer of 2012. I had taken a week off from my job in Phoenix and wanted to spend it somewhere quiet, away from the city noise, away from screens and routines. I drove north into Arizona, heading toward the Kaibab National Forest. I had been there once before when I was younger, but this time I wanted to be alone. I thought I could clear my head, maybe do some hiking, maybe sit by a fire and read until I got tired. The drive itself was long and hot at first, the sun beating down on my windshield, but once I got higher into the forest, the temperature dropped. The air was cooler, full of pine smell, the kind that sticks to your clothes and skin. I stopped at a ranger station to look at some maps and then kept going, finally pulling off the main road and onto a smaller dirt road that looked barely used. It twisted deeper and deeper until I found a flat clearing where the trees opened up just enough for me to set up camp. By the time I pitched my tent, the light was already fading. The clearing was quiet, just the rustle of the branches and an occasional bird flying overhead. I laid out my sleeping bag, unpacked my small stove, and got a fire going. The forest around me grew darker and darker until the only light was my fire. I ate some canned food, drank water, and leaned back against a log, staring up at the sky that had filled with stars. I thought it was perfect, exactly what I needed. The first night was uneventful. I woke up once when I thought I heard something walking near my tent, but it was faint and short-lived, probably just a deer, maybe even the wind. I fell back asleep. The second day, I went hiking a few miles north of where I had set up. The trail wasn't marked, but I followed a dry creek bed, thinking it would be easy to retrace my steps. The forest was thick, the ground covered in needles, and it was quiet enough that my own footsteps sounded too loud. I saw some elk tracks, some small animal burrows, but no people. I didn't pass a single person the whole day. That was the point though, so I didn't mind. By the time I made it back, the sun was setting again. I cooked, ate, and sat by the fire. But as the night dragged on, I started to notice something that unsettled me. The woods around me felt different. Still quiet, but not in the same peaceful way. More like they were holding their breath. I would hear faint cracks in the distance, like a branch snapping under weight. But when I turned my head, nothing moved. That night I woke up again, only this time it wasn't faint. Something was moving outside my tent. I froze in my sleeping bag, listening. The sound was slow, heavy. Crunch, pause, crunch. It circled halfway around my tent, then stopped. I held my breath, heart pounding so hard I thought whoever or whatever was out there could hear it. After a few minutes, the steps moved away. I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, I stepped out of the tent and scanned the ground. The pine needles didn't show much, but just beyond them, in a patch of dirt, I saw prints. They weren't hooves, they weren't paws. They were boots. Human. I stood there staring at them. I was at least 5 miles from the main road, off a dirt track most people wouldn't even notice. I hadn't seen a single car or hiker since I arrived. So why would someone be walking around my camp in the middle of the night? I tried to brush it off, telling myself maybe a hunter had passed through. But the prints were too close to my tent, too deliberate. I kept busy that day, gathering wood, fishing in a small stream nearby, anything to keep from thinking too much. But when night came again, my nerves returned. I built a bigger fire, thinking the light would keep anything away. I sat with my back against a tree, flashlight in my lap, trying to listen past the crackle of flames. It must have been past midnight when I heard it again. This time it wasn't footsteps. It was a low metallic sound, faint but clear, like metal brushing against metal. My stomach dropped. I turned off my flashlight, letting my eyes adjust to the dark. The sound came from the edge of the clearing, beyond the firelight. I stared hard, and that's when I saw movement. A figure. Someone was standing just inside the tree line, watching. I froze, gripping the flashlight so tight my knuckles ached. The figure didn't move for what felt like forever. Then, slowly, it stepped backward into the dark until I couldn't see it anymore. I didn't sleep at all. I sat up by the fire until morning, every muscle tight. When the sun finally came up, I walked to the edge of the trees. On the ground was a crushed beer can, not mine. And wedged into the bark of a tree nearby was a long scrape, like someone had dragged a knife across it. That was enough for me. I packed my gear as fast as I could, shoving things into my backpack without caring how neat it was. I loaded everything back into my car, my hands shaking the whole time. Driving out of that forest felt endless. The dirt road seemed longer than when I came in, every shadow between the trees making me glance over my shoulder. When I finally hit the paved road, I didn't stop until I reached a gas station near Williams. I sat there in the lot, hands gripping the steering wheel, my shirt sticking to my back with sweat even though the air conditioner was blasting. I kept thinking about how isolated I had been, how whoever was out there must have known it. There had been no reason for someone to be walking around my tent in the middle of the night. No reason to stand at the tree line and watch me without saying a word. No reason to drag a blade across bark inches from where I slept. I had always thought camping alone was peaceful, almost therapeutic. But after that, the idea of being out in the woods by myself changed. It wasn't nature that scared me. It was the thought of someone else out there, hidden in the dark, waiting. I never went back to that forest. I still camp sometimes, but always at campgrounds with other people around, never deep in the woods alone. Even now, years later, when I hear a branch snap outside my window at night, I feel that same chill run through me, the same one I felt sitting in that tent while footsteps circled in the dark. And what stays with me most isn't what I saw, it's what I didn't. Whoever was out there, I'll never know their face, their reason, or how long they had been watching me before I even realized it. I was 23 when I decided to drive out to northern Arizona for a short solo camping trip. It was the summer of 2014, and I had been working long weeks at a warehouse job in Phoenix, sweating through the heat and the concrete walls. I wanted space, quiet, and a break from people. I wasn't looking for adventure. I just wanted to sit under pine trees, breathe fresh air, and listen to silence that wasn't broken by forklifts and shouting voices. I packed up my old Ford Ranger with a secondhand tent, a cheap sleeping bag, some canned food, and a small propane stove. I brought a pistol with me too, not because I was planning to use it, but because I grew up around guns and carrying one on trips into the woods felt normal. My father always said that if you're alone in the middle of nowhere, you never really know what you might run into. The drive north took me about 3.5 hours. By late afternoon, I was climbing up into higher elevation where the saguaros disappeared, replaced by thick stands of ponderosa pine. The air cooled, smelled sharp and clean, and the sky was a deep blue with scattered clouds. I left the highway and followed a narrow forest road that twisted through the trees. Dust kicked up behind my truck, floating in the sunbeams that cut through the canopy. I passed no other cars. After about 6 miles, the road narrowed even more until it looked barely used. Grass grew between the tire tracks, and branches scraped the sides of my truck. I figured that was perfect. No crowds, no RVs, no people. I stopped when I found a flat clearing maybe 100 yards off the road. It was surrounded on 3 sides by thick pine forest, with a rocky slope on the 4th side. It looked private and safe. I set up my tent close to the trees for shade, unrolled my sleeping bag, and put my cooler under a tarp. By the time I finished, the sun was dropping low, shining golden light through the trees. The air had cooled so much that I had to put on a sweatshirt. I ate a can of chili heated on the propane stove and sat in a folding chair with my boots kicked out, watching the forest darken. The silence was different than in the city. It wasn't complete silence. There were little noises everywhere. The rustle of needles, the chirping of crickets, the occasional snap of a branch far away. The longer I sat, the more I realized how alive the forest really was, even though I couldn't see most of it. When night fell, it got black, darker than anything in the city. I had a lantern, but I turned it off for a while just to see the stars. The sky was so full of them it almost didn't look real. The Milky Way cut across the darkness like spilled salt. Eventually, I crawled into my tent and zipped the flap. The ground was hard, but I had a foam pad, and I was tired enough that I figured I'd sleep fine. It must have been close to midnight when I woke up the first time. At first, I didn't know what had woken me. The forest was still, but after a few seconds I heard something faint. A slow crunching, like footsteps on pine needles. My body froze, and I held my breath, listening. The steps were careful, not heavy, spaced out like someone trying not to make noise. I told myself it was probably a deer. That made sense. I had seen them plenty of times in the woods before. I listened harder, but the footsteps stopped. I waited, staring into the darkness of the tent, then eventually convinced myself it was nothing and rolled over. But maybe 20 minutes later, I heard it again. This time it was closer. Slow steps, deliberate stopping and starting. The kind of movement that didn't sound like an animal wandering, more like someone sneaking. I reached for the pistol I had left beside my sleeping bag. My hand wrapped around the grip, and I held it against my chest as I lay completely still. I thought about unzipping the tent and shining my flashlight outside, but something in me resisted. If it was an animal, it might run. If it was a person, I didn't want to announce myself. So I just lay there, breathing as quietly as I could, listening until the footsteps faded again. Sleep didn't come easy after that. I woke, dozed again, always half alert, gripping the pistol. Sometime deep in the night, I thought I heard something brush against the side of my tent, a faint dragging sound that made my skin crawl. But when I sat up, everything was still. By morning, the forest looked normal again. Bright, calm, almost innocent. I tried to laugh it off. Maybe it had been a deer or even my imagination, nerves playing tricks in the dark. Still, I felt unsettled. I made coffee on the propane stove and walked around the clearing, scanning the dirt for tracks. I found some near the trees, prints that looked human, though not clear enough to tell for sure. They were too large for deer, too narrow for elk. They could have been mine from the day before, I told myself. But I knew where I had walked, and these were in places I hadn't been. The rest of the day, I tried to relax. I hiked a little, sat by the truck reading a paperback, and gathered some firewood. By sunset, I had a small fire going, and the smoke curled up into the fading sky. But as the light drained out of the forest, I felt the same unease creep back into me. The trees seemed to press closer, shadows stretching longer, and I kept glancing over my shoulder even when nothing was there. That night, I stayed awake longer, sitting by the fire with my pistol on my lap. The forest was quiet except for the popping of the flames. Around midnight, just as I was starting to nod off, I heard it again, the same careful crunch of footsteps. This time, without question, it was not an animal. The steps circled slowly, staying just beyond the firelight. I strained my eyes, but the dark was too thick. I could hear the pace, the pauses, the deliberate weight shifting from one foot to another. Whoever it was, they were watching me. My mouth went dry, and my heartbeat thudded in my chest. I thought about yelling, thought about firing a warning shot, but some instinct told me to stay silent. If I shouted, I might reveal my fear or worse, give away exactly where I was sitting. I waited until the sound moved farther into the trees. Then, slowly, I doused the fire with dirt, grabbed my sleeping bag and pistol, and climbed into the cab of my truck. I locked the doors, slid the seat back, and sat there in the dark, trying to breathe quietly. Through the windshield, I could see only the faint outline of trees against the sky. Every so often, I thought I saw movement, but I couldn't be sure. The hours dragged. At some point, exhaustion pulled me into a shallow, uneasy sleep. When dawn finally came, I wasted no time. I stepped out, packed my gear as fast as I could, and tossed everything into the back of the truck. As I folded the tent, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. On the side facing the trees, the fabric was marked with long smears of dirt, like fingers had dragged slowly across it. That was enough. I didn't bother checking for more tracks. I climbed into my truck, started the engine, and drove out fast, bumping over the ruts and branches, not looking back until I was back on the highway with the morning sun rising behind me. I never went camping alone again after that. It's been years now, but sometimes when I think about that trip, I wonder what would have happened if I had unzipped the tent that first night, or if I had stayed out by the fire until whoever was there decided to step closer. I'll never know who it was or what they wanted, but I know for certain someone was out there watching me, and that's enough to keep me away from the woods at night. I went camping once in the summer of 2014 when I was 23 years old. I had driven out to the Lake District in northern England, trying to escape the noise of the city for a few days. I wanted to hike during the day and camp at night, nothing complicated. I had a small tent, a sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, and a simple plan to enjoy being away from people. The first day went well. I parked my car at the edge of a small village, strapped on my backpack, and walked for hours along the trails that twisted between green hills and patches of woodland. The weather was warm, the ground mostly dry, and I barely saw anyone after I got a few miles away from the main paths. I set up my tent in a clearing not too far from a stream. The sound of running water was steady, and the air felt fresher there. That night, I cooked pasta on my little gas stove and fell asleep quickly, with only the wind moving the branches overhead. The second day was different. I had planned a longer hike, maybe 10 miles out and back, with the idea of returning to the same spot to sleep. I walked through narrow valleys where the hills pressed close, and later I climbed high enough to see the lake shimmering in the distance. Clouds had gathered by the afternoon, and when I returned to my camp, the ground was damp with light rain. My tent was still fine, though, and I settled in for another night, reading a book by headlamp until I drifted off. What woke me was not thunder or rain, but something else. I remember lying there, my eyes snapping open in the dark, my heart beating too fast. It wasn't a sound that I could name, more like the kind of shift in silence that makes your body react before your brain can catch up. I switched off the headlamp, leaving myself in total blackness, and listened. The stream was still moving nearby, steady as before. The wind had died down, which made the stillness sharper. I told myself it was nothing, just the usual nervousness that comes when you sleep outside alone. I shifted in my sleeping bag, tried to relax, and after a while, I must have slept again. The next morning, though, when I stepped outside the tent, I noticed something odd. The ground near the edge of the clearing had been disturbed. The grass was bent and broken, and in the wet dirt I could see impressions, like someone had walked there not too long ago. I crouched down and saw the shape of boots. Not hiking shoes like mine, but heavier, flat-bottomed boots. The prints weren't old either. They were sharp around the edges, the kind you get when the ground is soft. I felt a chill even though the sun was out. The prints came from the tree line, moved across the clearing, and stopped a few feet from my tent. Whoever had made them hadn't walked through. They had just stood there, facing my tent. I stood staring at them for a long time. My first thought was that it could have been someone from the village, maybe a farmer or another hiker. But the area was remote, not the kind of place people wandered into by accident. And if it was a farmer, why walk straight up to a stranger's tent in the middle of the night and just stop there? The rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was near. Every sound in the woods seemed louder than before. I hiked a bit, but my mind wasn't in it. I kept looking behind me, scanning the trees, checking the ground for more prints. By evening, I debated whether to pack up and head back to the car, but it was a long walk and the light was fading fast. I didn't want to risk twisting an ankle in the dark. I told myself I was being paranoid and decided to stay one more night. I cooked dinner, ate quickly, and zipped myself inside the tent early. My body was tense, like it knew something I didn't want to admit. I tried to read again, but every few minutes I had to stop and listen. The woods seemed too quiet, almost like they were holding their breath. Sometime past midnight, I heard it. Footsteps, slow, heavy, moving on damp ground. They were faint at first, then clearer as they came closer. My mouth went dry instantly. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe too loud. The steps came to the clearing, just as they must have the night before. Then they stopped. The silence after that was worse than the sound itself. I could feel the presence of someone just a few feet away, standing in the dark, staring at the thin fabric of my tent. My heart was hammering so hard I was afraid it would give me away. I gripped the handle of the small knife I always kept near me when camping, though I doubted it would do much good. Minutes passed. I don't know how many, but it felt endless. Then, without a word, the steps moved again, slow and deliberate, back into the trees. The crunch of leaves faded until there was nothing. I lay there, stiff as a board, until dawn finally lightened the tent. When I came out, the grass was wet with dew, but the boot prints were there again. The same heavy shapes coming close to the tent and then turning back. My stomach twisted. Whoever it was had been there for at least 2 nights, watching me. That morning, I didn't waste time. I packed up everything fast, shoving things into my backpack without caring how messy it was. I didn't eat. I didn't even stop for water. I just started walking as quickly as I could toward the village. Every few minutes, I glanced over my shoulder, convinced I'd see someone behind me. The woods felt different now, darker, as if they were closing in. The hike back that had felt calm before now felt endless. Every rustle made me flinch. My legs ached from moving so quickly, but I didn't slow down. By the time I saw the rooftops of the village, my clothes were soaked with sweat. At the small car park where I had left my vehicle, I stopped and looked back once more. The path behind me curved into the trees, empty, but I knew what I had felt. I knew I hadn't imagined those prints, or the footsteps, or the weight of someone standing so close in the dark. I got in my car, locked the doors, and drove until I hit the main road. Only then did I let myself breathe properly again. I never went camping alone after that. Even years later, when I go hiking with friends, I catch myself looking at the ground for prints that don't belong to us. Because I know there are people out there who don't make a sound in the day, but watch in the night, waiting just outside the thin fabric of a tent. And the scariest part is not knowing why they do it, or what would have happened if I hadn't left when I did. I was 24 the summer I decided to camp out on my uncle's old farm in Kansas. It wasn't being used anymore, not since he got too old to work it, and most of the land had gone wild. The fields that once grew corn were thick with tall grass and weeds. The barn was leaning with its roof half caved in, and the fences were rusting and broken. I had been living in Wichita at the time, working long shifts in a warehouse, and I needed a break. I thought a few days alone on the farm would give me some quiet. I packed a tent, a cooler of food, a sleeping bag, and drove out one Friday afternoon in late July of 2012. The drive out was flat and open, nothing but endless farmland and empty highways. By the time I pulled up to the property, the sun was already dropping low, painting the sky orange and red. I parked my car on the dirt path near the barn. Everything was silent except for the buzzing of insects and the occasional croak of a frog from the creek that cut through the back of the property. I hadn't been there in years, and the place felt almost foreign, though I knew it well as a kid. My uncle used to keep cows, pigs, and chickens, but all of that was long gone now. The only signs of life were the tall stalks of weeds swaying in the breeze and the scattered tracks of animals in the dirt. I set my tent up near the barn, close enough to use the structure as a windbreak, but far enough that I didn't have to worry about the roof collapsing on me. Once the tent was pitched, I started a small fire in a pit I dug out. I cooked some hot dogs on sticks and sat on an old wooden crate I found by the barn, eating while the fire cracked. The night settled in quickly. The stars came out, clearer than I'd seen in the city, and the only light other than my fire was the pale moon hanging over the empty fields. It should have felt peaceful, but instead there was a strange weight to it. The silence wasn't relaxing. It was heavy, pressing down on me until I noticed every little sound. The crickets, the snapping of twigs in the weeds, the creak of the barn wood shifting in the breeze. By the time I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut, it was past midnight. I lay there listening to the night. I expected to fall asleep quickly, but every time I started to drift off, some sound outside would snap me awake again. A rustling in the grass, a soft thud, like something stepping on the packed dirt. Once, I thought I heard what sounded like a low cough, faint but human, coming from somewhere near the barn. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer, maybe a stray dog, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. The hours dragged. I must have dozed at some point because I woke up to the sound of something brushing against the side of my tent. Not hard, just the faint scrape of fabric being touched. I froze. My heart started pounding so loud it filled my ears. I stared at the nylon wall inches from my face, trying not to breathe too loud. It happened again, a slow drag, like fingers trailing along the tent. I didn't move. Then, just as quietly, it stopped. I waited. 10 minutes, maybe 20, couldn't tell. Finally, I worked up the courage to unzip the tent just enough to peek out. The fire had burned down to glowing coals. The barn loomed as a black shadow against the sky. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I noticed the weeds near the fence line moving in a way that didn't match the breeze. They shifted, parted, then went still again, as if someone had ducked down low to hide. I shut the zipper as slowly as I could and sat there in the dark, gripping the small pocket knife I had brought. Sleep was impossible after that. I stayed awake the rest of the night, every muscle tight, listening for more movement. But whoever or whatever had been there didn't come back close. When the sun finally rose, I stepped out of the tent. The air was cool, and the fields glistened with dew. At first, everything looked normal. Then I saw the ground around my campsite. There were footprints, not animal tracks, human ones. They circled the tent, stopping at different sides, as if someone had walked around me while I slept. I followed them a little way and saw they led back toward the tree line at the far edge of the property. The smart thing to do would have been to pack up and leave right then. But I convinced myself it was probably just some drifter, maybe a homeless person passing through, curious about the firelight. It unnerved me, but I didn't want to cut the trip short. I decided to stay one more night, but I moved my tent farther into the field, away from the barn and closer to the car. That whole day I tried to relax, went for a walk down to the creek, cooked breakfast on my camp stove, even lay in the grass reading. But the image of those footprints wouldn't leave my mind. As night came, I built another fire, bigger this time, and kept it burning. The darkness felt thicker that night, heavier. The noises started again, the faint shifting in the weeds, the occasional snap of a branch. Around midnight, I saw movement at the edge of the firelight. My eyes locked on it, just a shape low to the ground, then gone again. My skin prickled. I kept my knife in one hand and my flashlight in the other, refusing to look away from the dark. Hours passed. I was nodding off when I heard a clear sound, the crunch of a footstep on gravel, right by the path near my car. I swung my flashlight and caught a glimpse of a figure. A man, crouched low, wearing dirty jeans and a hooded jacket. His face was shadowed, but I knew he saw me, because the second the beam hit him, he bolted. He didn't run toward the road, though. He darted back toward the barn, disappearing into the black shape of the broken structure. I didn't chase him. I didn't move. I just sat there, gripping the knife until my hand ached, staring at the barn as if he might come back out. He never did. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I packed everything in a frenzy. Tent, cooler, chair. I stuffed it all into the car without caring how sloppy it was. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting him to step out of the weeds, but the fields stayed empty. When I finally started the car, I didn't even look back. I drove fast down the dirt path until I hit the highway, and I didn't slow until I saw other cars around me. I never told my uncle what happened. I never told anyone for a long time, but I know what I saw. That farm wasn't as empty as I thought. Someone had been living out there, hiding in the ruins of the barn, watching me while I slept. Maybe he was harmless, maybe he just wanted food, but the way he circled my tent, the way he came back the second night, crouching in the dark, that wasn't harmless curiosity. I never camped there again. In fact, I never camped alone again, not anywhere. The memory of those footsteps, the hand brushing against the tent, the man darting into the barn, it never left me. Every time I think about it, I feel the same cold fear crawling up my back, reminding me that the scariest things aren't the ones we make up in stories. They're the people who are really out there, waiting in the dark where you least expect them. I was 26 in the summer of 2014 when I decided to take a short camping trip in the northern woods of Minnesota. I had been working long weeks in construction, sweating under the sun every day, and my body needed a break from the sound of machinery and people yelling directions at each other. I wanted peace, and for me, that meant being alone in the quiet of nature. I wasn't an expert camper, but I knew enough to keep myself safe. Set up a tent, make a fire, pack enough water and food, and keep a first aid kit close. I left on a Friday morning with my old Ford pickup, tossing a small cooler in the back and strapping down my pack. The road was long and empty once I left the town behind, miles of pine trees closing in on both sides. I drove on dirt tracks where the dust rose behind me, and I didn't see another car for nearly an hour. It was the kind of isolation I was looking for. By early evening, I found a clearing about a quarter-mile off a narrow trail. It was flat, close to a creek, and surrounded by tall trees. I parked my truck under some branches, carried my gear down, and started setting up camp. The sky was heavy with clouds, and the air smelled like rain. The woods were quiet, just the rustle of branches and the water running over rocks. I set up my tent facing the tree line, laid out my sleeping bag, and got a small fire going before the light faded. The fire crackled, warming my hands, and I ate a sandwich while sitting on a log I had dragged over. It was peaceful in the way I had hoped, but even then, I felt a strange tightness in my chest. Maybe it was the silence. At home, there were always distant noises. Cars, people, something. Here it was so still that every snap of a twig sounded louder than it should have. By the time the rain started, I had already crawled into the tent. Drops tapped against the nylon, steady at first and then harder. I listened to it for a long time, the wind pushing against the trees, the water running faster in the creek. It must have been close to midnight when I finally drifted off. I woke up hours later, unsure what had stirred me. The rain had slowed, but the forest was different. My ears caught something out of place. The faint smell too, like iron, sharp and thick, mixing with the wet earth. I lay still, holding my breath, straining to listen. I told myself it was just the damp ground and rotting leaves, but the smell didn't fade. When morning came, the woods were gray, the clouds hanging low. I stepped out of the tent, stretching my stiff back. My boots sank into the wet dirt, and the air felt colder than yesterday. I went to the creek to splash water on my face, but halfway there, I noticed something. The soil near the bank had been disturbed. It wasn't from the rain. It was deeper, rougher, as if something had been dragged. At first I thought maybe a deer had slipped through, maybe carried downstream. But the marks were wide, and the mud looked pressed down by something heavy. My stomach tightened. Against my better judgment, I followed the trail a little further down the bank. That's when I saw it. A boot. It was sticking out of the mud at a crooked angle, dark leather swollen with water. My chest went cold, but I couldn't look away. I stepped closer, my legs stiff, and the rest of it came into view. The rain had washed some of the dirt away, and the shape beneath it was too human to mistake. A man's body, half buried in mud, face turned to the side, pale skin stretched tight. His clothes were torn, and one arm was bent under him unnaturally. The smell hit me hard now, raw and sour, the kind of smell that fills your throat and makes you want to gag. I staggered back, my heart racing so fast it hurt. I had never seen a dead body before, not like this. Every instinct told me to run back to the truck and get out, but the trail back was rough, and I knew if I panicked I'd make mistakes. I stood there for a while, just staring, frozen between fear and shock. When I finally got myself moving, I didn't touch him. I didn't want to. Instead, I marked the spot in my head, the crooked tree by the creek, the sharp bend where the water pooled. I went back to my camp, stuffing everything I had into my pack. My hands shook so bad I dropped the lighter twice. I doused the fire with what was left of my water, not caring if smoke rose. I just needed to leave. The hike back to my truck felt longer than before. Every sound in the woods made me jump. A bird breaking through branches above had me spinning around, breathing heavy. By the time I reached the truck, my clothes were damp with sweat despite the cold air. I threw my gear in without care and started the engine, the sound of it loud and alive compared to the quiet woods. Driving back down those dirt roads, I kept looking in the mirror, half expecting another vehicle to appear or someone to step out from the trees. But no one came. It was just me and the endless woods. I didn't stop until I reached a small gas station nearly 40 miles out. My voice was shaky when I told the clerk to call the sheriff that I had found a body by the creek north of the trail. The police arrived an hour later. I waited in my truck, trying not to replay the image in my head, but it kept flashing back. The boots sticking out of the mud, the pale face, the smell. When the deputies questioned me, I told them everything exactly as it happened, down to where my camp was, how far the body was from the creek. They didn't give much back, only that they'd send a team out to check. It was nearly dark when they let me go. I drove home that night, headlights cutting through the black road, my mind heavy and restless. For days I couldn't eat properly, couldn't sleep without seeing him lying there. The news later mentioned that a missing man from Duluth had been found dead in the woods, cause under investigation. They didn't release details, but I didn't need them. I knew what I saw. Even now, years later, I remember the smell most of all. The way it carried in the wet air, sticking to my skin, making my stomach twist. I had gone into those woods looking for quiet and peace, but what I found instead was the kind of silence that hides things you're not supposed to see. I never camped alone again after that. I was 24 years old in the summer of 2016 when I decided to spend a few nights camping in the woods just outside a small town in northern Arkansas. I had been working long weeks and wanted to get away from people, from noise, and from screens. I packed light: a small green tent, a sleeping bag, a knife, a flashlight, some dry food, and a cheap rain jacket I had thrown in without much thought. It was late August, hot and sticky during the day, but the forecast had warned about storms rolling through that weekend. I figured a little rain wouldn't hurt. I had camped plenty of times before, though mostly in fair weather. I set up my tent near the tree line, not too deep into the woods, but far enough from the dirt road so I wouldn't hear passing trucks. The area was a mixture of thick oaks, hickories, and pine, and the ground was soft from a recent drizzle. By the time I got everything arranged, the sky was already darkening. The air had that heavy, metallic feel it gets before a storm. I started a small fire, cooked some instant noodles, and ate quietly while the crickets grew louder in the background. By 9 o'clock, I could see flashes of lightning in the distance. They lit up the sky in sudden bursts, showing the dark shape of the forest against the horizon. The thunder was still far off, rolling softly like waves, but I knew it was coming closer. I poured water over the fire, making sure it was fully out, and zipped myself into the tent. I laid back, trying to relax, listening to the first light taps of rain hitting the fabric above me. At first, it was almost calming, the steady rhythm of water dripping through the branches. The air cooled down and the smell of wet earth filled the tent. But soon the rain grew heavier, pounding hard, and the wind picked up. Branches creaked and swayed. The thunder was much louder now, shaking the ground with every crack. I could hear the rush of water beginning to form little streams down the slope where I had pitched camp. I thought about whether I had chosen the wrong spot, whether the tent might start leaking or flooding, but I stayed still, trying to wait it out. Around midnight, I woke suddenly. I wasn't sure if it was the thunder or something else, but my heart was beating fast. The rain was still coming down in sheets, and I could hear the low roar of wind sweeping through the trees. I turned on my flashlight and saw that a corner of the tent had started leaking. Drops of water were soaking into my sleeping bag. I cursed under my breath and shifted everything to the driest part, but I knew it wouldn't last long. Then, in between the thunder, I heard something different. It was faint at first, almost like a branch snapping, but sharper. I held my breath and listened. Through the roar of the storm, I heard it again, closer this time. A quick, hard crack of something heavy stepping on wet wood. My first thought was deer, maybe moving down the slope for shelter. But it didn't sound like the light steps of a deer. It was slower, heavier, and irregular, like someone dragging their feet in the mud. I froze. I didn't move for what felt like minutes. Every instinct told me to stay silent. The rain masked most sounds, but the footsteps kept coming, stopping, then starting again. I flicked off my flashlight and sat there in the dark, listening with every nerve in my body stretched tight. Suddenly, there was a loud rustle against the side of my tent, like something brushing past. My skin crawled. I held my knife tight in my hand, though I knew how useless it would be if something or someone decided to come inside. The sound lingered for a moment, then moved past me. I could hear it circling slowly, water sloshing as it stepped in puddles. I thought about unzipping the tent and running for the dirt road, but the storm outside was so violent that I could barely imagine making it 50 feet without slipping or getting lost. My only choice was to stay put and stay quiet. My breathing was shallow, my throat dry. The steps moved off after a while, fading into the distance. For a long time, all I heard was rain, thunder, and the shaking of leaves. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back down and I dozed off, though it was restless and shallow. When I opened my eyes again, it was early morning. The rain had stopped, but everything was soaked. My tent sagged under the weight of water, and the air smelled of wet dirt and pine sap. I stepped outside, my clothes damp and sticky, and looked around. The forest floor was torn up with deep footprints. They weren't animal tracks. They were human, large, and fresh, pressed into the mud in a slow, uneven pattern that wound all the way around my camp. I felt a shiver run through me as I realized how close someone had been while I lay there listening in the dark. I packed up quickly, shoving everything into my bag without caring if it was wet. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees. The woods were silent, except for the dripping of water from the branches. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone might still be out there watching. The trail back to the dirt road felt longer than it had when I came in. The mud was slippery, sucking at my boots, and I nearly fell more than once. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear in the trunk and sat inside with the doors locked, breathing hard. Driving away, I passed only one other vehicle on the road. A rusted old truck parked half hidden near the trees. No one inside. I didn't stop to look closer. I kept going until I hit the highway, and even then I didn't stop until I was miles away. The whole drive back, I replayed the night in my head. The storm, the heavy steps, the sound of someone brushing against my tent. The footprints were proof it wasn't just my imagination. Someone had been out there, moving slowly around me in the pouring rain, circling while I sat in the dark. I don't know if they meant to scare me, to rob me, or if they were just wandering, but I know they weren't lost. No one stumbles around in the woods in weather like that without a reason. I never camped alone again after that. I still go outdoors, still hike, but when the sun goes down and the rain begins, I always make sure there are people nearby, people I trust. Because that night taught me something I'll never forget. Sometimes the scariest thing in the woods isn't an animal or a storm. It's another person, walking just outside your tent in the dark, waiting for reasons you may never know. I was 34 the year I decided to spend a week hunting alone in the thick woods of northern Idaho. I had been on plenty of trips before, but usually with friends or my brother. This time I wanted the quiet, the test of being fully by myself. It was mid-October of 2016, and the weather had already turned cold. The nights dipped well below freezing, and frost clung to the ground in the mornings like a thin sheet of glass. I drove an old pickup out to the edge of the forest and parked where the dirt road ended. From there, I hiked in with my pack, rifle, tent, and gear strapped tight. The first day wasn't bad. I walked a few miles into the trees, found a small clearing beside a stream, and set up camp. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. I could hear nothing but the water moving over rocks and the faint calls of birds deeper in the timber. It was the kind of silence that felt heavier than usual, like the whole forest pressed in around me. The first couple of nights were uneventful. I hunted during the day, saw some tracks, but didn't get close enough to anything worth taking. I'd return before dark, start a small fire, cook something simple, and crawl into my sleeping bag. It was quiet, peaceful even. But by the third night, I started noticing things that didn't sit right. It began with noises after sunset. I'd be lying in the tent, staring at the thin fabric walls glowing orange from the fire outside, and I'd hear something crunch through the brush. At first, I figured it was deer moving nearby, but the steps didn't sound like the light, quick movements of deer. They were slow, deliberate, and heavier. Sometimes it seemed like they circled at a distance, just far enough to stay unseen. I gripped the rifle across my chest in the tent until I fell asleep from exhaustion. On the fourth day, I pushed deeper into the woods. I wanted to see if I could find fresher signs of elk. The terrain was rough, steep ridges covered in fallen logs, tangled brush, and thick patches of spruce. Around noon, I came across an old hunting blind, nothing more than a few rotting boards nailed into a tree. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. I remember standing there, looking at it, wondering who had built it and how long ago they had stood in the same spot, waiting in silence like I was now. By late afternoon, I hadn't seen much, and I decided to turn back before the light dropped. On the way, I caught that same sound again. Steps somewhere behind me, timed with mine. I'd stop and it would stop. I'd walk, and after a few beats, I'd hear it again. I spun around more than once, scanning the trees through my scope, but the woods were still. Nothing moved.
No birds flashed, no branches shifted.
Just silence. I pushed harder, heart pounding, until I reached camp. I lit the fire bigger that night, higher than I needed, the flames throwing tall shadows across the clearing. I sat with my back to a log, rifle resting across my knees, eyes locked on the tree line. Every snap of wood in the dark made my stomach tighten. Eventually, I crawled into the tent, but I didn't sleep much. I lay there listening, waiting, thinking about those heavy steps out there. The fifth day was worse. I woke up to find boot prints in the frost near the edge of camp. At first, I thought they might have been mine from the day before, but when I checked, they weren't. They came in from the trees, circled near the tent, and went back out toward the stream. My skin went cold. Someone had walked through my camp while I slept. I didn't know if they'd been watching me or just passing by, but the prints were fresh, sharper than mine from the day before. I spent the whole day unsettled, moving slower, constantly checking over my shoulder. I didn't hunt much. Instead, I stayed closer to camp, listening for movement. I thought about leaving that night, but hiking out in the dark would have been worse. So I decided to stick it out until morning. That night, the noises returned. This time closer. Sticks cracked, brush shifted, and I swore I heard breathing outside the tent. Not an animal snorting or rustling, but the steady sound of lungs filling and emptying, controlled and quiet, just a few feet away from the thin layer of nylon separating me from the dark. My hand gripped the rifle so tight my knuckles hurt. I didn't move, didn't breathe heavy, just lay frozen for hours, eyes wide open. At some point, the noises stopped, but I never truly slept. The first light, I packed everything fast. My hands shook as I stuffed the tent and strapped it to my pack. The woods felt different, too still, too heavy. As I started hiking back toward the truck, I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees, catching shapes in the corner of my eyes that disappeared when I turned. A few miles in, I spotted more tracks. Fresh boots pressed into the mud, leading the same way I was heading. Whoever it was had walked ahead of me, maybe not long before. My chest tightened, and I slowed down, afraid I'd catch up to them, or worse, that they were waiting. It took hours to finally reach the dirt road. My truck sat alone, exactly where I left it, but something was wrong. The passenger door was cracked open just a few inches. I knew for a fact I'd locked it. My heart pounded so hard I thought I'd faint. I crept closer, rifle raised, scanning the cab. The seat had been rummaged through, my glove box hanging open, papers scattered across the floor. Whoever had been out there had been inside my truck, maybe looking for something, maybe just to let me know they could. I didn't waste time. I tossed my gear in the bed, climbed in, locked the doors, and fired the engine. The gravel spit under my tires as I pulled away, eyes darting to the mirror, half expecting someone to step out from the trees behind me. I didn't breathe easy until I hit pavement miles later. Even then, the unease sat heavy in my chest. The forest that had once felt peaceful now seemed like it had swallowed me whole and spit me out with a warning. When I got home, I thought about going to the sheriff, but what could I even say? That I'd heard noises, found prints, and someone had broken into my truck? They wouldn't find anyone out there in that endless stretch of woods. Whoever it was, they knew those forests better than I did. Maybe they lived out there, maybe they just didn't want me around. Either way, I never went back to hunt alone again. I was 24 years old when I decided to take a short camping trip in the Lake District in northern England. It was late September of 2016, the kind of time when summer has slipped away but autumn hasn't fully taken hold. The days were still bright, but the evenings dropped quickly into cold dampness that seemed to creep into your bones. I had taken time off work and wanted to clear my head, so I packed my small tent, a sleeping bag, a small gas stove, and a rucksack full of food. My plan was simple: spend 2 nights alone near one of the less busy trails, enjoy the quiet, and get away from the endless noise of London. I arrived at the base of the trail early in the afternoon, parked my car near a small stone wall, and started walking up with everything strapped to my back. The trail wound around grassy hillsides, with sheep scattered across them like white dots. I didn't pass many people, which was part of why I chose this route. After about 2 hours of steady walking, I reached a flatter area with a view of the valley below. There was a patch of short grass near a cluster of small trees, and it felt like the right spot to set up camp. I pitched my tent, cooked some noodles on my stove, and watched the sun sink down behind the hills. The light turned the clouds pink and orange, and I felt a strong sense of peace. By the time it was fully dark, the temperature had dropped sharply. I climbed into my sleeping bag, zipped the tent flap shut, and listened to the faint rustle of wind through the grass. That first night was uneventful. I woke up once to the sound of what I thought was a fox moving around, but when I looked out, all I saw was the vague outline of hills against the sky. I drifted back to sleep. The next day, I decided to hike further up, leaving most of my gear behind in the tent. I carried just water, a snack, and a map. The climb was harder, with loose rocks underfoot, but the views made it worth it. I hardly saw another soul all day, just one older man with trekking poles who nodded at me and kept walking. By the time I got back to my tent, I was tired but satisfied. The air had gotten even colder, and I knew I was in for a rough night if the temperature dropped further. After eating, I sat outside my tent for a while, wrapped in a jacket, watching the stars. There were more than I'd ever seen in the city, a thick scatter of white light across the black sky. That's when I noticed something odd. Down in the valley, just at the edge of the trees, there was movement. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer, but as I kept watching, I realized it was a person. She was standing still, facing up the slope toward me. At that distance, I couldn't see her face, but I could make out the shape of her body. She wore something light-colored, maybe a coat or a dress, and her posture was stiff. I remember feeling a cold rush through my stomach as I realized she wasn't moving at all, just standing there, almost like she was staring. I tried to brush it off. People hike in strange places, sometimes wander off trails. Maybe she was lost. I looked away, telling myself not to think too much about it. When I looked back a few minutes later, she was gone. That night, sleep came slowly. I kept hearing noises outside, faint snaps of twigs or the crunch of something stepping on grass. Every time I unzipped the tent flap and shined my torch out, there was nothing but darkness and silence. I forced myself to close my eyes, reminding myself that being alone in the hills makes every small sound feel larger than it is. But sometime deep in the night, I woke up again. My body felt frozen, not just from the cold, but from a heavy sense of unease. I opened my eyes and realized there was a faint shadow on the outer wall of the tent, as if someone was standing close by. The light from the moon behind the clouds made it clear. The silhouette of a person, standing still, only a few feet away. I didn't move. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The shadow stayed there for what felt like forever. Then, without sound, it slowly shifted away. I lay in silence until morning, hardly daring to breathe. When daylight came, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The grass around my camp looked disturbed, pressed down in certain places, like someone had been walking in circles. There were faint shoe prints, too smaller than mine, leading from the slope down toward the valley. I told myself again that maybe it had been some lost hiker, someone who didn't mean harm. But deep down, it didn't feel right. Something about the way she just stood there, not saying anything, not moving, left a mark on me. I packed up my things quickly, deciding one night had been enough. As I rolled up my sleeping bag and folded my tent, I kept glancing over my shoulder. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The walk back down was quiet. The wind had picked up, carrying a damp chill from the west. When I reached the car park, my relief was overwhelming. I shoved my gear into the boot, climbed inside, and locked the doors. Just as I turned the key, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. On the stone wall a few feet from where my car was parked, there was a single scrap of fabric caught on the edge. It was pale, almost white, like part of a coat or dress, fluttering in the breeze. I hadn't seen it when I first parked there 2 days earlier. I drove away quickly, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror more than I should have. The road twisted down through the hills, empty and wet from the mist. I didn't see anyone on the way out, but the thought of that woman, standing silently in the valley, stayed with me. Even now, years later, I think about it. I never told many people the full story because it sounds strange, almost like a trick of the mind. But I know what I saw. I know there was someone out there, and I know she came close to my tent in the night. The silence, the way she stood motionless, the disturbed grass in the morning. None of it was my imagination. What unsettles me most is that I'll never know why. Was she just lost and confused? Was she watching me for some reason I'll never understand? Or was it something worse? Something I was lucky to walk away from? That trip was the last time I ever camped alone.